Centuries before the first Tomahawk missile left its silo, before Predator drones began their silent vigils in the clouds, the Ottoman Empire was perfecting a brutal new art: total war. Not the kind born in the mud of the 20th century, not the kind designed in the laboratories of the digital age. This was something older, colder, more deliberate. While Europe built its cathedrals and crowned its kings, while feudal lords counted their peasants and trusted that stone walls would keep the darkness out, something was being assembled in the East, piece by piece, man by man, cannon by cannon. And by the time the world finally understood what had been built, was already too late. The 15th century was a world built on stone, towering fortifications, century-old walls, battlements engineered to outlast entire dynasties. The men who built them believed one thing above all else: permanence. They were wrong. In the foundries of the sultans, a different kind of fire was burning. Not just to melt iron, not just to cast bronze. This fire was consuming an entire age. It turned the impenetrable into rubble. It turned the eternal into dust. And it rewrote permanently the geometry of power. Today, we speak of strategic depth, precision strikes, technological overmatch. We assume these concepts were born in the digital age. We are wrong. They are descendants of a philosophy forged 5 centuries ago in Ottoman iron and Ottoman will. History is often told through kings and crowns, but its true course is forged in the suffocating heat of the foundry and in the cold calculations of the engineer. In the spring of 1453, the walls of Constantinople still stood. They had stood for 1,000 years, withstood siege after siege, outlasted empire after empire, swallowed the ambitions of every army that had ever dared approach. But on that spring morning, they met something they were never designed to face. Not an army hunting for cracks in the mortar, not a force praying for a gate to give way, a force that simply erased them. For the first time in human history, heavy siege artillery was deployed not as a support weapon, but as a strategic strike force, designed not merely to breach a wall, but to dismantle an empire's identity. In that singular moment, the knight's armor became a coffin, the castle's tower became a static target, and the medieval world ended. In modern warfare, the most advanced weapon is worthless without the right operator. The Ottomans understood this with a clarity their contemporaries never reached. While European monarchs scraped together seasonal peasant levies and bent to the demands of feudal lords with divided loyalties, the sultans were building something none of them had ever conceived: a human machine. At its heart, the Janissaries, the world's first professional standing army, in the truest, most modern sense of the word. Through the Devshirme system, the empire reached deep into its outer territories and extracted its most capable minds and strongest bodies. These men were not merely trained, they were engineered, taken young, molded over years, stripped of family ties, local allegiances, personal history, and individual ambition. until only one thing remained: absolute service to the Sultan. No distractions, no divided loyalty, no competing purpose. They lived in high-intensity institutions, the Janissary Training Corps, where they mastered the composite bow, the matchlock musket, and most critically, synchronized volley fire. Not the clash of individual heroes, not the glory of personal combat. Massed, rhythmic, mechanical. The discipline they brought to the battlefield wasn't simply fearlessness. It was something far more unsettling. The cold efficiency of men who had become pure instruments of the state. By the time they reached the front lines, they were not soldiers seeking glory. They were specialists, operating with the controlled, lethal precision of a machine. But a weapon needs reach. That reach came from the Tamarli Sipahis, the heavy cavalry of the empire. In peacetime, they governed the land they protected. In war, they became the armored fist. Hundreds of thousands of riders, self-sustaining, combat-ready at a moment's notice. The central treasury bore almost none of their cost. Every coin saved was redirected toward one thing: the cutting edge. And then there was the infrastructure that made it all possible. The Menzil system, a vast network of fortified supply depots and post stations, positioned along every major strategic artery of the empire. An Ottoman army of 100,000 men could sustain a march of 20 miles a day across months of campaign, fed, armed, and resupplied without ever breaking stride. Warm food, fresh horses, standardized dry gunpowder, always prepared, always waiting. There is an old military truth, one that endures across every era. Amateurs study tactics. Professionals study logistics. The Ottomans didn't study it. They built their empire on it. If the men were the software, the technology was the hardware. And the Ottomans commanded the most formidable hardware the world had ever seen. In the secret foundries of Edirne, a Hungarian engineer named Urban stood before Sultan Mehmed II with a single proposition: a weapon beyond imagination, the Shahi. These were not ordinary cannons. They were monuments to engineered destruction. Cast from bronze, capable of hurling a 1,200-pound granite sphere with devastating calculated force. So massive, they required 60 oxen and hundreds of men to move, over roads specially reinforced just to carry their weight. The metallurgical sophistication required to cast them was decades ahead of anything in Western Europe. When the Shahi roared, the sound traveled for miles. But the message it carried traveled for centuries. Every thunderous shot was not merely a physical impact. It was a declaration to every king and every lord in every court on earth. The stone fortress as sanctuary is finished. The psychological devastation matched the physical blow. The ground shook beneath defenders' feet. Men who had never broken in battle broke. Because when the earth itself trembles beneath you, no wall in the world feels safe anymore. Then came Chaldiran, 1514. Sultan Selim the Resolute against the legendary Safavid cavalry. The Safavids were fearless, brilliant with the blade, masters of mounted warfare. They charged into a wall of fire. The Ottomans had deployed mobile artillery, chained together, forming an unbreakable, continuous defensive line. The Tabur Chengi, the wagon fort, a kill zone of obscuring smoke, gunpowder, and lead. While the Safavids honored the ancient tradition of individual heroism, the Ottomans were calculating firepower density and rate of fire. The hero who charges alone dies alone. Victory belongs to the system that projects the most force in the shortest time. This was the birth of combined arms warfare. 5 centuries before the Doctrine had a name. A body can be broken by steel, but a war is won or lost in the mind. The Ottomans understood psychological warfare with a precision that modern military doctrine still struggles to fully replicate. Picture the plain of Mohacs, 1526. A Hungarian knight watches the morning mist begin to lift over the marshy ground. And from that mist, they emerge. The Delilah, an elite Ottoman shock unit. Giants wrapped in the raw skins of leopards and bears. Massive eagle wings rising dark and wide from their shoulders. Eyes that carried no trace of fear whatsoever. Their name meant the Demented, not because they were broken, but because they had moved entirely beyond the reach of death. Western diplomats of the era, men like Ogier Ghiselin de Busbecq, documented them not as soldiers, but as mythological nightmares given flesh. Men who smiled as they advanced toward the enemy line. They wore no heavy armor, carried no defensive shield. They didn't need it. Their weapon was not steel. It was what they did to the enemy's mind before a single blow was ever struck. At Mohacs, the Hungarian elite lost their formation and their will in under 2 hours. The battle was decided long before the first blade found flesh. Shock and awe, delivered with feathers and fur. And beneath it all, the rhythm, the meter, the world's first organized military band. But calling them musicians is a fundamental tactical error. The meter was a weapon. The massive kus drums, mounted on camels and elephants to maximize their resonance, produced low-frequency vibrations that could be physically felt in the chest of an enemy from miles away. Infrasonic warfare. The subwoofers of the 16th century. For Ottoman soldiers, the meter beat was a shared heartbeat, synchronized, relentless, unstoppable, turning thousands of individual men into a single, breathing, marching organism. For the enemy standing across the field, it was the sound of an approaching storm, a steady, rhythmic signal that no matter how many men they cut down, the machine would keep advancing, perfectly in time, without hesitation, until the end. The smoke eventually cleared. The drums eventually fell silent. But what the Ottoman War Machine left behind was not merely conquest. It was a blueprint. The rigid rank structures of modern armed forces, the doctrine of the professional standing army, the centralized military-industrial complex, the strategic deployment of psychological operations. None of these are modern inventions. They are echoes. Echoes of decisions made in the red dust of Ottoman campaigns. Echoes of fire from Ottoman foundries. Echoes of iron discipline from Ottoman barracks. The Ottomans were the first to treat war not as a sport for the nobility, but as a science of systems. They understood something their rivals refused to accept, that in the age of gunpowder, courage alone was no longer a strategy. The curved swords of the Sipahis have long since rusted. The great bronze cannons of the Topane foundry have grown cold and silent. But the strategic mind forged across those centuries of relentless expansion still echoes in war rooms, in command centers, in the operational doctrine of every serious military power on Earth. They taught the world a truth that has never expired. In the clash of civilizations, the victor is never the one with the bravest knights. It is always, always the one with the most efficient machine. You have seen the iron, the fire, the discipline that rewrote history. But the machine did not stop at the shoreline. In our next episode, we follow the empire toward the horizon, where the blue of the sea meets the gray of the sky. We follow Barbarossa and the story of how the entire Mediterranean became an Ottoman lake. The machine is primed. The only question is, are you ready to see the rest of the blueprint?